The earliest memory I have of my mother is sitting at our kitchen table on a Saturday morning when I was maybe 6 years old, watching her balance our checkbook with the kind of focused concentration most people reserve for complex puzzles. Eleanor Whitaker had this way of biting her lower lip when she was deep in thought, her pen moving across the ledger in neat, precise rows. I remember asking her what she was doing, and she'd looked up at me with those warm brown eyes and said, "Making sure we're okay, sweetheart. Making sure we're always okay." Even then, I understood that being okay required constant vigilance, constant effort, that security wasn't something that just happened, but something you had to work for every single day. We lived in a small two-bedroom apartment on the east side of town, the kind of building where the hallways always smelled faintly of cooking, and the walls were thin enough that you could hear your neighbors' televisions. Our apartment was on the third floor, and I used to count the steps every time we climbed them. 42 steps. My mother would be breathing hard by the time we reached our door, especially after a long shift at work, but she never complained. She'd unlock the door, we'd step inside, and she'd transform our modest space into something that felt like home through sheer force of will and love. She worked as an administrative assistant at County General Hospital, the public facility across town, not Prescott Memorial, which was the private hospital where wealthy families went, but County General, where the waiting rooms were always crowded and the staff always seemed rushed and overwhelmed. She'd been there for 12 years by the time I started elementary school, working her way up from receptionist to a position that came with slightly better pay and slightly better benefits. Slightly better, but never actually good. Never enough to change our fundamental circumstances. My mother had dreams for me that were bigger than anything she'd ever dreamed for herself. She'd grown up poor in a small rural town, the daughter of a factory worker and a waitress, and she'd never had the opportunity for higher education. She'd graduated high school, moved to the city hoping to find something better, and ended up in a series of administrative jobs that paid enough to survive, but never enough to thrive. She'd married young, to a man I barely remembered, and that marriage had fallen apart before I was 3. He'd left, disappeared completely, and she'd raised me alone ever since. But she was determined that my life would be different. She read to me every single night when I was little, even when she was exhausted from double shifts. We'd sit together on my narrow bed, and she'd read books she'd borrowed from the public library. Not just children's books, though we read plenty of those, but anything she thought might expand my understanding of the world. History books, science books, biographies of people who'd accomplished great things. She wanted me to understand that the world was bigger than our small apartment, bigger than our neighborhood, full of possibilities if I was willing to work hard enough to reach them. I loved learning. That was the gift she gave me, maybe the greatest gift anyone ever gave me. I loved the feeling of understanding something new, of having my mind expand around a concept that had been mysterious just moments before. In elementary school, I was the kid who actually got excited about homework, who finished assignments early and then asked the teacher if there was more I could do. The other kids thought I was weird, and maybe I was, but I didn't care. I had found something that felt like power, like control. Knowledge was something that belonged to me, something that nobody could take away. My mother would come home from work exhausted, her feet aching from standing all day, her eyes tired from staring at computer screens and processing endless paperwork, but she'd still sit with me at our kitchen table and help me with homework. Not that I needed much help, even early on, but she was there, present, engaged. She'd ask me questions about what I was learning, push me to think deeper, to make connections between different subjects. She treated my education like it was the most important project in the world, and in our small world it was. We didn't have much money for extras. Vacations were day trips to parks or museums with free admission. New clothes came from discount stores, bought one size too large so I'd grow into them and they'd last longer. Entertainment was the library and broadcast television. But we had books everywhere in our apartment. My mother would buy them at yard sales and used bookstores, spend $1 here and $2 there, to build a collection that filled the one bookshelf in our living room, and then started stacking on the floor. We were rich in books, even if we were poor in everything else. By the time I reached middle school, I had become the kind of student teachers noticed. I was quiet, not particularly social, but consistently excellent. I turned in every assignment on time. I scored well on every test. I participated in class discussions with a level of preparation that suggested I actually cared about the material, which I did. My 6th grade English teacher, a soft-spoken woman named Catherine Bennett, pulled my mother aside during a parent-teacher conference and told her that I was gifted, that I had real academic potential, that she should consider enrolling me in advanced programs. My mother cried in the car on the way home that night. Happy tears. She kept saying, "I knew it. I knew you were special. I knew all of this was going to be worth it." I didn't feel special. I just felt like I was doing what came naturally, following the path that made sense. But seeing how proud she was, seeing how much it meant to her, that her sacrifices were leading somewhere, that made me want to work even harder. High school brought new challenges and new opportunities. Jefferson High School was the only public high school that served our area, which meant it drew students from a wide range of neighborhoods and economic backgrounds. The school itself was a sprawling brick building that had been constructed in the 1970s and showed its age in countless small ways. The lockers were dented and covered in layers of paint from decades of institutional color changes. The floors were scuffed linoleum that squeaked when you walked on them. The cafeteria smelled like industrial cleaning products and overcooked vegetables. But it had a decent academic program, particularly for students willing to work hard and take advantage of the advanced placement courses. I entered Jefferson High as a freshman in the fall of 2020. A skinny 14-year-old kid carrying a backpack full of carefully organized notebooks and a determination to prove that I belonged in the advanced track. The social landscape of high school was immediately apparent and impossible to ignore. There were distinct groups, clear hierarchies, invisible but rigidly enforced boundaries about who associated with whom. The wealthy kids were easy to identify. They wore expensive casual clothes that somehow managed to look effortlessly stylish. They had the latest phones and laptops. They drove to school in nice cars or got dropped off by parents in luxury vehicles. They talked about weekend trips to beach houses and ski resorts, about concerts and restaurants and experiences that seemed to exist in a completely different world from the one I inhabited. They weren't necessarily mean, most of them, just completely separate. We shared physical space but existed in parallel universes that rarely intersected. The kids from my neighborhood, the working-class area on the east side of town, had our own social circles. We were the students who took the bus to school, who brought lunches from home, instead of buying the expensive cafeteria options, who wore the same outfits multiple times a week because we had limited wardrobes. We weren't ashamed exactly, but we were aware of the differences, aware of our place in the hierarchy, aware that certain doors were closed to us, not because of our abilities, but because of circumstances beyond our control. I found my people in the advanced placement track. Not all AP students were from working-class backgrounds, but many were. We were the scholarship hopefuls, the kids who understood that academic excellence was our ticket to something better. We studied together in the library during lunch periods. We formed study groups for difficult classes. We pushed each other to score well on standardized tests, to maintain perfect GPAs, to build the kind of academic records that would make us attractive to universities looking for diversity in their student bodies. My closest friend during freshman year was a kid named Isaac Sterling. No relation to the wealthy Sterling family that lived in the Riverside district. Just an unfortunate coincidence of names. Isaac was brilliant at mathematics, could solve complex equations in his head, but struggled with English and history. I was strong across all subjects, but had to work harder at math than he did. We complemented each other well. We'd spend hours at the public library after school, him helping me with calculus problems, me helping him write essays that would earn more than a B-. There was also Natalie Harlow, a girl from my neighborhood who was determined to become the first person in her family to attend college. She was intense about academics in a way that sometimes worried me, staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning to perfect assignments, having small panic attacks before major tests. But she was kind and funny when she allowed herself to relax, and she became one of the few people I felt comfortable talking to about the pressure we all felt to succeed. And there was Oliver Caldwell, who was perhaps the most naturally intelligent person I'd ever met. He absorbed information like a sponge, seemed to understand complex concepts immediately without the grinding study time that I required. But he was lazy in a way that frustrated me. He'd skip classes, turn in assignments late, coast on natural ability rather than pushing himself to real excellence. I used to tell him he was wasting his potential, and he'd shrug and say that life was too short to spend it all studying. I didn't understand that perspective then. I do now, but back then it seemed incomprehensible. My teachers recognized my work ethic early. My freshman English teacher, a middle-aged man named Cameron Whitfield, wrote on my first essay, "This is college-level analytical work. Keep this up, and you'll have your choice of universities." My biology teacher, Gabriel Thornton, recommended me for a competitive summer science program. My history teacher, Harrison Montgomery, started giving me extra reading materials and suggesting books that went far beyond what was required for class. But the teacher who mattered most was my guidance counselor, Maxwell Harlow. Mr. Harlow was a thin, energetic man in his 40s who genuinely cared about helping students navigate the path to college. He wasn't related to Natalie Harlow as far as I knew, but he took a particular interest in students from working-class backgrounds, students who had the ability to succeed in higher education, but needed guidance on how to make it financially possible. I met with Mr. Harlow for the first time in the spring of my freshman year. He'd called me down to his office, a small room crammed with college brochures and motivational posters about believing in yourself and reaching for your dreams. He had my academic record pulled up on his computer screen, and he was smiling. "Jonathan," he said, "I want to talk to you about your future. Your grades are exceptional. Your teachers all speak highly of your work ethic. If you maintain this trajectory, you're going to be a very attractive candidate for universities with generous financial aid programs." I remember feeling a surge of hope and anxiety mixed together. "Really? I know I do okay, but I didn't think—" "More than okay," Mr. Harlow interrupted. "You're currently ranked in the top 5% of your class, and you're only a freshman. There are several universities that actively recruit students like you, students who demonstrate both academic excellence and financial need. They want diversity in their student bodies, and they're willing to pay for it through full-ride scholarships." He spent the next hour explaining the landscape of college admissions and financial aid. He talked about how important it was to maintain my GPA, to take the most challenging courses available, to build a well-rounded application with extracurricular activities and community service. He explained the SAT and ACT, how they worked, what scores I should be targeting. He outlined a 4-year plan that would position me as a top scholarship candidate. I left his office that day feeling like my future had suddenly become real and tangible. It wasn't just my mother's dream anymore. It was a concrete plan with specific steps and achievable goals. I could see the path forward. I just had to work hard enough to stay on it. Sophomore year brought more advanced courses and more responsibility. I took AP World History, Honors English, advanced mathematics, chemistry. My days became a routine of classes, homework, study sessions, and more homework. I didn't go to parties, I didn't date, I didn't participate in sports or many social activities. My life revolved around academics and the goal of achieving the kind of record that would earn me a full scholarship. My mother supported this single-minded focus completely. She'd come home from work, make dinner, and then we'd sit together at the kitchen table working. Her on hospital paperwork she'd brought home, me on homework and studying. We'd work in comfortable silence, occasionally looking up to smile at each other, partners in the project of building a better future. She never let me see how hard she was working to make ends meet, but I wasn't blind. I saw the stack of bills on the kitchen counter. I noticed when she started taking extra shifts, coming home even later, looking even more exhausted. I heard her on the phone sometimes, negotiating with utility companies about payment schedules, asking for extensions on deadlines. She was stretching every dollar as far as it would go, and it still never seemed to be quite enough. I tried to help. I applied for a part-time job at a fast food restaurant when I turned 16. My mother made me quit after 2 weeks. She said my job was to focus on school, that working would jeopardize my grades, that the small amount of money I could earn wasn't worth the risk to my future. I argued with her, but she was firm. My education was the investment that would pay off long term. Everything else was a distraction. It was also during sophomore year that Dominic Prescott first entered my awareness, though not through any direct interaction. He was a year ahead of me, a junior, and he moved through Jefferson High with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to worry about consequences. I noticed him because he was impossible not to notice. He was loud, always surrounded by friends, always laughing about something. He drove a BMW to school, parked in the prime spots near the front entrance. He wore expensive clothes with designer labels that probably cost more than my mother made in a week. But what really caught my attention was the way teachers treated him. He'd show up late to class, and they'd just nod and tell him to take a seat. No detention, no consequences. He'd turn in assignments late, and somehow he'd still pass. I watched him sleep through an entire AP history class once, his head down on his desk, and the teacher, Mr. Montgomery, just let him sleep. When class ended and Dominic woke up, Mr. Montgomery actually apologized for the lecture being boring. I couldn't imagine being treated that way. If I showed up late, I got marked tardy. If I turned in an assignment late, my grade was docked. The rules were enforced for students like me, but apparently they were optional for students like Dominic Prescott. I asked Isaac about it one day during lunch. What's the deal with that guy? How does he get away with everything? Isaac barely looked up from his math homework. His dad owns Prescott Memorial Hospital. The family donates a ton of money to the school. They just renovated the science wing last year. The Prescott name is on a plaque in the front hallway. You really think teachers are going to fail the son of a major donor? That's not fair, I said. Welcome to how the world works, Isaac replied, turning back to his equations. I thought about that conversation a lot over the following months. The idea that fairness was an illusion, that merit mattered less than money and connections, that the system was rigged in favor of people who were already winning. It bothered me deeply because it contradicted everything my mother had taught me. She believed that hard work and integrity would be rewarded, that if I just did everything right, the world would recognize my effort. But watching Dominic Prescott coast through school on his family's reputation, I started to wonder if she was wrong. Junior year was when everything intensified. I was taking 5 AP courses, maintaining a 4.0 GPA, preparing for the SAT. My life had become a machine of productivity, every hour scheduled, every activity purposeful. I woke up at 5:30 every morning, studied until it was time to catch the bus, attended classes, studied during lunch, attended more classes, went to the library after school, studied until it was time to catch the bus, attended classes, studied during lunch, attended more classes, went to the library after school, studied until it was time to catch the bus, attended classes, studied during lunch, attended more classes, went to the library after school, studied until it was time to catch the bus, attended classes, studied during lunch, attended more classes, went to the library after school, studied until it was time to catch the bus, attended classes, studied during lunch, attended more classes, went to the library after school, studied until it was time to catch the bus, attended classes, studied during lunch, attended more classes, went to the library after school, studied until it was time to catch the bus, attended classes, studied during lunch, attended more classes, went to the library after school, studied until it was time to catch the bus, attended classes, studied during lunch, attended more classes, went to the library after school, studied until it was time to catch the bus, attended classes, studied during lunch, attended more classes, went to the library after school, studied until it was time to catch the bus, attended classes, studied during lunch, attended more classes, went to the library after school, studied until it was time to catch the bus, attended classes, studied during lunch, attended more classes, went to the library after school, studied until it was time to catch the bus, attended classes, studied during lunch, attended more classes, went to the library after school, studied until it was time to catch the bus, attended classes, studied during lunch, attended more classes, went to the library after school, studied until it was time to catch the bus, attended classes, studied during lunch, attended more classes, went to the library after school, studied until it was time to catch the bus, attended classes, studied during lunch, attended more classes, went to the library after school, studied until it was time to catch the bus, attended classes, studied during lunch, attended more classes, went to the library after school, studied until it was time to catch the bus, attended classes, studied during lunch, attended more classes, went to the library after school, studied until it was time to catch the bus, attended classes, studied during lunch, attended more classes, went to the library after school, studied until it was time to catch the bus, attended classes, studied during lunch, attended more classes, went to the library after school, studied until it was time to catch the bus, attended classes, studied during lunch, attended more classes, went to the library after school, studied until it was time to catch the bus, attended classes, studied during lunch, attended more, closed, took the bus home, ate dinner with my mother, studied until midnight, slept, and repeated the cycle the next day. It sounds exhausting in retrospect, and it was, but I was driven by a clear purpose. Mr. Harlow had shown me updated projections for my scholarship prospects, and they were excellent. I was ranked second in my class, just behind a girl named Victoria Sterling, who was brilliant and dedicated, and also from a wealthy family, which meant she had every advantage. But being ranked second was still good enough. Several universities had already sent recruitment materials. MIT, Stanford, Duke, Northwestern, schools I'd barely dared to dream about. Full scholarship offers were practically guaranteed if I maintained my current trajectory through senior year. My mother glowed with pride. She'd cut out an article from the local paper about top students at Jefferson High, a small piece that mentioned my name among the academic achievers. She'd put it on our refrigerator, held in place by a magnet shaped like an apple. Every morning we'd both see it, a reminder of how far we'd come and how close we were to the finish line. Senior year started with so much promise. I was 17 years old, ranked second in my class of 340 students, captain of the academic quiz team, member of the National Honor Society, a young man who had done everything right and was about to be rewarded for it. The first few months were smooth. I submitted my college applications in October, earlier than most students, because I'd been preparing for years and everything was ready. Perfect essays, stellar recommendations, a transcript that demonstrated consistent excellence across a rigorous curriculum. Mr. Harlow called me into his office in late October to discuss my applications. He was beaming, actually beaming, as he reviewed the materials I'd submitted. "Jonathan, this is some of the strongest application work I've seen in my 15 years as a guidance counselor. Your personal essay about your mother's influence on your education is genuinely moving. Your academic record speaks for itself. I've received preliminary expressions of interest from 3 of your top choice schools. One admissions officer specifically mentioned you're exactly the kind of candidate they're looking for. Full scholarship offers are essentially guaranteed at this point. You just need to maintain your grades through graduation." I remember how that felt, sitting in his small office, hearing that everything I'd worked for was about to pay off. I remember thinking that my mother was right, that the system did reward merit, that hard work and dedication did matter. I was going to be the first person in my family to attend college. I was going to have opportunities my mother never had. I was going to make her sacrifices worth something. That was October. Everything changed in November. It started small. My mother seemed more tired than usual. She'd always been tired, working long shifts and then coming home to manage our household, but this was different. She'd come home and immediately collapse on the couch, struggling to find the energy to move. She started skipping our evening study sessions at the kitchen table, saying she just needed to rest. She lost her appetite, would make dinner for me, but barely eat anything herself. I noticed, but I convinced myself it was just stress. She'd mentioned problems at work, budget cuts and staff reductions that meant everyone was being asked to do more with less. She was probably just overwhelmed and overworked. It would pass. She'd rest over Thanksgiving break and feel better. But Thanksgiving came and went, and she didn't feel better. She felt worse. She'd lost weight, enough that her clothes hung loose on her frame. Her skin looked gray, almost translucent. She moved slowly, carefully, like someone much older than her 43 years. She started calling in sick to work, which she'd never done before, not in all the years I'd known her. "Mom, you need to see a doctor," I told her one evening in early December. She was lying on the couch, too exhausted to even watch television, just staring at the ceiling. "I can't afford to see a doctor right now," she said softly. "The co-pays, the tests they'll want to run. We don't have the money, Jonathan." "Then we'll find the money. This is serious. Something's wrong." "I'm just tired," she insisted, but her voice had no conviction. Her supervisor at County General finally forced the issue. A colleague called our apartment one evening and explained that my mother had nearly passed out during her shift, that she'd been sent home, that she absolutely needed to get medical attention or she wouldn't be allowed back to work. Workers' compensation covered an initial evaluation, so she had no excuse. The first doctor's appointment was on a Tuesday in mid-December. I skipped my afternoon classes to go with her, driven by an anxiety I couldn't quite name. We sat in the waiting room at a clinic for 2 hours before she was finally called back. I wasn't allowed to go with her for the examination. I sat alone with outdated magazines and tried not to imagine worst-case scenarios. When she emerged 40 minutes later, her face told me everything I needed to know. The doctor wanted more tests, blood work, imaging, a biopsy. They'd found something concerning, something that required immediate follow-up. The receptionist handed her a stack of paperwork and a list of appointments at different facilities, all scheduled over the next 2 weeks. The insurance coverage from her employer was basic. It covered some of the diagnostic tests, but not all. She'd have to pay for portions out of pocket. We didn't have savings. Every dollar my mother earned went to rent, food, utilities, my education. There was nothing left over for medical emergencies. She started selling things. Small things at first, items we didn't absolutely need. An old laptop that still worked. Some jewelry she'd inherited from her mother. A few pieces of furniture. The money helped, but it wasn't nearly enough. The medical bills started arriving before we even had a diagnosis, and they were staggering. Hundreds of dollars for a single test. Thousands for the imaging scan. I watched my mother deteriorate over those 2 weeks of diagnostic tests. The fatigue got worse. She developed a persistent cough. She couldn't eat more than a few bites at meals without feeling nauseous. She started spending most of her time in bed, too weak to do much else. I tried to take care of her, making simple meals, helping her to the bathroom when she was too weak to walk steadily, sitting with her in the evenings while she drifted in and out of sleep. My grades started slipping. Not dramatically, not in a way that most people would notice, but I noticed. I got a B+ on a calculus test that I should have aced. I turned in an English paper that was adequate, but not exceptional. I missed 2 days of school to go with my mother to appointments. My teachers were understanding, telling me to make up the work when I could, but I could see their concern. Mr. Harlow pulled me aside in the hallway one day and asked if everything was okay at home. I told him my mother was dealing with some health issues, but everything was under control. I couldn't bear to explain the truth. Couldn't bear to admit that my entire world was falling apart. The diagnosis came 2 days before Christmas. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3. The doctor explained it in clinical terms, talking about tumor size and lymph node involvement and metastatic potential. She explained that pancreatic cancer was aggressive, fast-moving, one of the deadliest forms of cancer, but it was treatable if caught early enough, if treatment started immediately. Surgery to remove the tumor, chemotherapy, possibly radiation. A comprehensive treatment plan that could give my mother years, maybe even decades if we were lucky. The doctor outlined the treatment plan with a calm, professional demeanor. Then she discussed the cost. The surgery alone would be $60,000. Chemotherapy would be another $40,000 or $50,000, depending on how many cycles were needed. Our insurance would cover approximately 60% of the costs, maybe less depending on how the claims were processed. We'd be responsible for the remaining 40%, plus various out-of-pocket expenses that wouldn't be covered at all. We were looking at somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000 that we'd need to pay ourselves. Money we didn't have, money we couldn't imagine how to get. My mother sat in the doctor's office and nodded calmly, as if she were hearing information about someone else's life, someone else's cancer. She thanked the doctor. She collected the treatment plan documents and the financial information. She scheduled a follow-up appointment. She walked out of that building, with her head held high, maintaining her dignity even as her world collapsed. She broke down in the car, not loud, dramatic crying, but quiet. Hopeless tears streaming down her face as she sat in the passenger seat, staring at nothing. I'd driven us to the appointment in her ancient Honda, a car that barely ran but was all we had. I sat there in the clinic parking lot, my hands gripping the steering wheel, feeling more helpless than I'd ever felt in my entire life. "We'll figure it out," I said, knowing it was a lie. "There has to be a way. Financial assistance programs, charity organizations, something." She didn't respond. She just kept crying silently, and I think we both understood in that moment that all the hard work, all the sacrifices, all the careful planning and budgeting and determination, none of it had prepared us for this. Some problems couldn't be solved by working harder or being smarter. Some problems required money, and we simply didn't have enough. We spent Christmas researching options, not celebrating, not even pretending to have a normal holiday, just desperately searching for any possible way to afford her treatment. We applied to every charity organization we could find that provided financial assistance for cancer patients. Most of them had waiting lists months long. Several had already exhausted their annual funding. A few accepted our applications but warned us not to expect anything, that they received far more requests than they could fulfill. We looked into medical loans. Banks wouldn't touch us with our income level and credit history. Predatory lenders offered loans at interest rates that would have trapped us in debt for the rest of our lives. We considered crowdfunding, setting up one of those online fundraising campaigns, but my mother was too proud. She didn't want to beg strangers on the internet for money. We tried to negotiate with County General Hospital, where the treatment would be performed. They offered a payment plan, but the monthly payments were still more than we could afford. They needed money up front before they'd even schedule the surgery. The oncologist my mother had been assigned to was sympathetic but firm. They couldn't proceed with treatment until we'd secured financing. Every week we waited was a week the cancer continued growing, spreading, killing her. I couldn't focus on anything else. My college applications, which had seemed so important just weeks earlier, now felt completely meaningless. My senior year classes, my careful maintenance of my perfect GPA, none of it mattered compared to my mother dying. I stopped going to the library after school. I stopped preparing for the SAT. I spent every spare moment researching treatment options, financial assistance programs, any possible solution to this impossible problem. Mr. Harlow noticed. He called me back to his office in early January. "Jonathan, I need to talk to you about your grades. Your teachers are reporting that you seem distracted, that your work quality has declined. You've missed several assignments. Is there something going on that I should know about?" I stared at him, this kind man who'd been so supportive, who'd invested so much time in helping me plan my future, and I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. If I told him, it would make it real. If I told him, he'd look at me with pity, and I couldn't bear that. "Just some family stuff," I said. "I'm handling it. It won't affect my applications." But it was already affecting my applications. I could see it in Mr. Harlow's face. He'd been fielding inquiries from universities, answering questions about my continuing academic performance, and he was concerned. My perfect record was no longer quite so perfect. The trajectory that had seemed so certain just months ago was beginning to wobble. It was a colleague of my mother's who first mentioned Prescott Memorial Hospital, a woman named Madeline Caldwell who worked in a different department at County General but knew my mother casually. She'd heard about the cancer diagnosis through the hospital grapevine, the way news always spread in close-knit workplaces. She pulled me aside one day when I came to pick up my mother after a particularly difficult shift. "I heard about your mom's diagnosis," she said quietly. "I'm so sorry. I know how expensive treatment is, how impossible it seems to afford it. Have you considered reaching out to Prescott Memorial?" "That's a private hospital," I said. "We can't afford private treatment." "I know, but the Prescott family has a foundation. They help patients in financial need sometimes, provide treatment at reduced cost, or write off the expenses entirely. Theodore Prescott, the owner, he's known for philanthropy. There's a whole wing of the hospital that was built with charity funds. It's worth trying at least. What do you have to lose?" What did we have to lose? The question haunted me over the next few days. My mother was running out of time. The cancer wasn't waiting for us to figure out finances. Every day without treatment was a day closer to her death. And here was this possible solution, this wealthy family that supposedly helped people exactly like us. Maybe they would understand. Maybe they would see that my mother deserved a chance, that she'd worked hard her whole life, that she was a good person who just had terrible luck. My mother was hesitant. She'd heard stories about the Prescotts, about how selective they were with their charity, how you needed the right connections or the right story to capture their attention. She didn't think we'd qualify, but she was also dying, and desperate people will try anything. "Maybe you should go," she finally said one evening in mid-January. She was sitting on the couch wrapped in blankets, even though the apartment was warm. "Maybe if they met you, saw how smart you are, saw how much potential you have, they'd want to help. I don't have the strength to go myself, but you could explain our situation. You're good at explaining things." I should have known better. I should have recognized that begging for charity from wealthy people was a strategy that rarely worked, that the rich didn't become rich by giving away money to every desperate person who asked. But I was 17 years old and terrified of losing my mother, and desperation has a way of making terrible ideas seem reasonable. I put together a folder with documentation: my mother's medical records, the treatment plan, our financial information, letters from her employer confirming her income and years of service, a personal statement I wrote explaining our situation, describing how my mother had dedicated her life to healthcare administration and to raising me, how she deserved a chance at treatment. I polished that statement like it was a college application essay, crafting every sentence to be as compelling as possible. On a cold afternoon in late January, I took the bus across town to Prescott Memorial Hospital. I had never been to that part of the city before. It was where wealthy people lived and worked, where the buildings were newer and cleaner, where the streets were lined with trees and the cars and parking lots were luxury vehicles. Prescott Memorial Hospital stood on a small hill overlooking the river, a gleaming modern complex of glass and steel that looked more like a high-end hotel than a medical facility. I walked through those glass doors into a lobby that took my breath away. The floor was polished marble, probably real marble, with intricate patterns inlaid. The walls were painted in soothing earth tones and decorated with original artwork, not the cheap prints you'd see in a regular hospital. There were comfortable leather chairs arranged in conversation areas. Soft music played from hidden speakers. Everything was clean and beautiful and expensive in a way that made me feel immediately out of place. The woman at the reception desk looked up as I approached. She was middle-aged, professionally dressed, wearing a name tag that identified her as Madeline Caldwell. A different Madeline Caldwell than the one who'd suggested this, or maybe the same one working a second job, I didn't know. She smiled politely. "Can I help you?" I explained that I needed to speak with someone about financial assistance for medical treatment. I kept my voice steady, professional, trying not to sound as desperate as I felt. She listened with an expression that was sympathetic, but also suggested she'd heard this kind of request many times before. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. "No, but I was hoping—" "Financial assistance applications need to be submitted through our website," she explained, her tone patient but firm. "You fill out the forms online, submit supporting documentation, and someone from the foundation reviews your case. The process typically takes 4 to 6 weeks. We don't have 4 to 6 weeks," I said, my voice starting to crack. "My mother has cancer, stage 3 pancreatic cancer. She needs to start treatment immediately. Every day we wait makes her chances worse." The receptionist's expression shifted to genuine concern. "I'm sorry to hear that, I truly am, but I don't have the authority to expedite the process or make exceptions. The online application is the only way to be considered for assistance." I tried to remain calm, tried to explain the urgency again, but I could feel panic rising in my chest. This wasn't working. I'd come here hoping to talk to someone with authority, someone who could make a decision, and instead I was being sent to fill out online forms that would take weeks to process. My mother didn't have weeks. The receptionist suggested I wait while she checked if any administrators were available. She made some phone calls, speaking quietly into her headset. I sat in one of those expensive leather chairs, clutching my folder, watching wealthy people move through the lobby, a woman in designer clothes, an older man being pushed in a wheelchair by an attentive nurse, a family speaking in a language I didn't recognize, probably international patients here for luxury medical care. They all belonged here in a way I absolutely did not. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 minutes, a young man in business casual attire approached me. He introduced himself as Gabriel Langston, administrative assistant to the hospital director. He had the kind of smooth, professional demeanor that suggested he was very good at handling difficult situations. "I understand you're hoping to discuss financial assistance," he said, sitting down next to me. "Why don't you tell me about your situation?" I went through everything: my mother's diagnosis, the treatment plan, our financial situation. I showed him the documentation I'd brought, let him look through the medical records and financial statements. I explained that we'd already applied to every charity organization we could find, that we'd tried to negotiate with County General Hospital, that this was our last hope. Gabriel Langston listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions, reviewing the paperwork with apparent interest. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. "I want you to understand that I genuinely sympathize with your situation," he said. "Cancer is devastating, and the financial burden of treatment is something many families struggle with. But Prescott Memorial Hospital's financial assistance programs are extremely competitive. We receive hundreds of applications every month, far more than we can possibly help. The foundation has limited resources, and we have to make difficult decisions about how to allocate them." "But you do help people," I said. "I've read about it. The Prescott family is known for philanthropy. We do help some people, yes, but our assistance typically goes to patients who are already receiving treatment here, who have established relationships with our physicians, whose cases have been personally reviewed and recommended by our medical staff. Walk-in requests from people who aren't current patients they're just not something we can accommodate through informal channels." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. He was saying no. Politely, professionally, but definitely saying no. "What about the expedited process?" I asked. "The receptionist said applications take 4 to 6 weeks. Isn't there a faster way?" "The standard process is the best I can offer. Submit the application online. Make sure all documentation is included. It will be reviewed in the order it's received. If your mother's case meets our criteria, we'll reach out to discuss next steps." "And if we don't meet the criteria?" Gabriel Langston looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Then we'll notify you of the decision and provide information about other potential resources." I wanted to argue, to plead, to make him understand that this wasn't just paperwork and procedures, that this was my mother's life, but I could see in his expression that it wouldn't matter. He was an administrator following protocols. My desperation wasn't his responsibility. He stood, preparing to end the conversation. "I really am sorry," he said. "I hope your mother receives the care she needs." He started to walk away. I stood up, holding my folder, feeling like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, watching my last hope disappear. And that's when I heard the laughter. A group of young people had entered the lobby through a side entrance. There were 5 of them, all around my age, all dressed expensively, all carrying coffee drinks from some boutique cafe. They were laughing about something, completely carefree, existing in that bubble of wealth and privilege where serious problems simply didn't exist. And leading the group was Dominic Prescott. I recognized him immediately, even though we'd never directly interacted. Everyone at Jefferson High knew who Dominic Prescott was. He looked exactly the same as he did at school, maybe slightly more polished since he wasn't wearing his usual casual school clothes, but instead business casual slacks and an expensive-looking sweater. His hair was perfectly styled. His smile was easy and confident. He looked like someone who'd never experienced a moment of genuine hardship in his entire life. Something broke inside me in that moment. Some internal barrier between rational thought and desperate action. Here I was, being politely refused by an administrator, told to go home and fill out forms and wait weeks for a decision that would probably be another polite no, while the son of the man who owned this hospital walked through the lobby like it was his personal playground. Dominic Prescott could probably make a phone call and get my mother into treatment immediately. He could probably secure financial assistance with a single conversation with his father. He had the power to save her life, and he was laughing about something trivial with his rich friends. I didn't plan what happened next. I just acted. I walked across the lobby, moving quickly before I could talk myself out of it. Gabriel Langston called my name behind me, telling me to wait, but I ignored him. Dominic and his friends had stopped near a bank of elevators, still talking and laughing. I approached them, my heart pounding, my hands shaking. "Dominic Prescott," I said, my voice louder than I'd intended. He turned, looking mildly annoyed at being interrupted by someone he didn't know. His friends stopped talking and turned to stare at me. I suddenly became aware of how I must look to them. A skinny kid in a cheap jacket and worn jeans, clearly not someone who belonged in this beautiful building, intruding on their private conversation. "Do I know you?" Dominic asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. "We go to Jefferson High together," I said. "I'm Jonathan Whitaker. I need to talk to you about something important." One of his friends, a girl I recognized as Brielle Mercer from school, whispered something to the person next to her. They smirked. Dominic just looked impatient. "Okay," he said. "What?" And then I explained everything. The words poured out of me in a rush, uncontrolled, desperate. I told him about my mother's cancer, about how we couldn't afford treatment, about how I'd come to this hospital hoping to get financial assistance. I told him that I knew his father owned the hospital, that I knew the Prescott family helped people sometimes, that I was begging him to please talk to his father about our case. I told him my mother was dying, and this was our only chance. I could see the expressions of his friends changing as I spoke. The smirks disappeared, replaced by a mixture of discomfort and embarrassment. Not embarrassment for me, though that was probably part of it, but embarrassment at being forced to witness someone else's desperation, at having their pleasant afternoon interrupted by reality. When I finished, there was a long, awful silence. Dominic stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then, incredibly, he laughed. Not a nervous laugh or an uncomfortable laugh, but genuine amusement, like I'd just told the funniest joke he'd ever heard. "You're serious right now?" he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You actually came to my family's hospital to beg for money." "I'm not begging," I said, though we both knew that was a lie. "I'm asking for help. Your family has the resources to—" "Do you have any idea how many people try this?" Dominic interrupted, his tone shifting from amused to contemptuous. "Every single day someone shows up here with a sob story about how they can't afford treatment. Cancer, heart disease, whatever. Everyone thinks their situation is special, that they're the exception, that we owe them something just because they're desperate. I'm not saying you owe us anything," I tried to explain. "I'm just asking if—" "Let me explain something to you," Dominic said, and his voice took on a lecturing tone, like a teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow student. "My father built this hospital by running it like a business. Not a charity, a business. If we gave free treatment to every person who showed up and asked for it, we'd be bankrupt within a year. Healthcare is expensive, really expensive. The people who can afford to pay high prices subsidize the operational costs. That's how the system works." Brielle Mercer giggled. "This is so awkward." "It's pathetic," Dominic corrected her, looking at me with undisguised disdain. "What's your name again? Jonathan something?" "Jonathan Whitaker," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Right, Jonathan Whitaker. You're one of those scholarship kids at Jefferson, aren't you? Always studying, always trying so hard. I've seen you around. You're in the library all the time. He said it like it was an insult, like working hard was something shameful. I nodded, unable to speak. Here's some life advice, Jonathan, Dominic said, and his tone became almost kind, which somehow made it worse. Life isn't fair. Some people are born into families with money and connections. Other people aren't. That's just how the world works. There's no changing it. My father earned his wealth through smart decisions and hard work. Our family earned the right to live well and to make our own choices about who we help and when. We don't owe anything to people who show up uninvited demanding special treatment. I'm not demanding, I said, but my voice cracked. I'm just, please, she's my mother. She's all I have. If she dies. Tears were threatening now, burning behind my eyes. I was going to cry in front of Dominic Prescott and his friends, going to completely humiliate myself, and I couldn't stop it from happening. Look, Dominic said, glancing at his friends as if seeking confirmation that he was handling this correctly. I'm sorry your mom is sick. I really am. But that's not my problem. It's not my father's problem. Your family's financial situation is your responsibility, not ours. If you can't afford treatment, then you should have had better insurance or more savings or something. That's basic personal responsibility. One of his friends, a guy named Sebastian Bennett, who I recognized from the lacrosse team, looked uncomfortable. Dom, maybe we should what? Dominic snapped. Give him money? Solve his problems for him? That's not how the real world works, Sebastian. He turned back to me, and his expression hardened. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave this hospital. You're going to stop bothering people who actually belong here. And you're going to figure out your family's problems on your own, like everyone else has too. Don't come back here. Don't try to contact me or my father again. This conversation is over. I should have left. I should have turned around and walked away with whatever dignity I had left. But desperation makes you do stupid things. I reached out and grabbed Dominic's arm, not aggressively, just trying to keep him from walking away, trying to make him listen. Please, I said one more time. Please, just talk to your father. Just ask him. That's all I'm asking. Dominic jerked his arm away from me violently, like my touch had contaminated him. His expression transformed from contempt to anger. Don't touch me, he said, his voice cold and dangerous. Don't ever touch me. Gabriel Langston and the receptionist had called security. 2 large men in uniforms appeared seemingly out of nowhere, flanking me. One of them took my arm, firmly but not painfully. Sir, you need to leave the premises, the security guard said. Wait, now. The guard insisted, already guiding me toward the exit. Dominic and his friends were already walking away, heading toward the elevators, resuming their conversation as if I'd never interrupted them. I heard Brielle say something about crazy people and heard the others laugh, like I was entertainment, like my desperation was amusing. The security guards escorted me through those beautiful glass doors and out into the cold January afternoon. Gabriel Langston followed us outside. He waited until the guards released me, then stepped closer, his expression a mixture of sympathy and warning. Jonathan, I understand you're in a difficult situation, but what you just did was inappropriate. You can't approach family members of hospital administrators uninvited. You can't create disturbances in our facility. If you attempt to come back here or contact any member of the Prescott family again, we will press charges for trespassing and harassment. Do you understand? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I'm sorry, he said, and he actually sounded like he meant it. I hope things work out for your mother. Then he turned and went back inside, leaving me standing on the sidewalk outside Prescott Memorial Hospital as it started to snow. I watched wealthy people in expensive cars pull up to the entrance. Watch staff members in clean scrubs move through those glass doors. Watch the building that could save my mother's life, but had just rejected me completely. I stood there until I was shivering from the cold, until the snow had covered my shoulders and hair, until the sun started to set and the temperature dropped even further. Then I walked to the bus stop, waited 40 minutes for the bus that would take me back to my side of town, and went home to tell my mother that I'd failed. She was sitting on the couch when I came in, wrapped in blankets, looking smaller and frailer than I'd ever seen her. She took one look at my face and understood immediately what had happened. "Oh, sweetheart," she said softly. "Come here." I sat next to her, and she put her arms around me, and I cried. Not quiet, dignified tears, but loud, choking sobs that I couldn't control. I cried for my mother who was dying. I cried for the humiliation of begging for help and being laughed at. I cried for the injustice of a world where some people got everything and others got nothing. I cried until I couldn't cry anymore, until I was exhausted and empty. "It's okay," my mother kept saying, stroking my hair like she used to when I was little. "It's okay, we'll find another way. This isn't over." But we both knew it was over. We both knew there was no other way. We'd tried everything. We'd exhausted every option. The cancer was growing inside her, and we were powerless to stop it. The next few weeks were a nightmare that seemed to stretch on forever. My mother tried to keep working, needing the income, even though the physical toll was devastating. She'd come home from shifts barely able to stand, would collapse immediately, and sleep for hours. The cough got worse. She started having trouble breathing. Her skin took on a yellowish tint, a sign that the cancer was affecting her liver. At school, the story of what happened at Prescott Memorial Hospital spread like wildfire. Dominic had told people, had turned it into an entertaining anecdote about a crazy scholarship kid who'd shown up begging for money and had to be removed by security. The details changed depending on who was telling the story. Some versions claimed I'd been screaming and threatening people. Others said my family was trying to scam the hospital with a fake illness. A few said we were planning to sue the Prescotts for discrimination. None of it was true, but truth didn't matter. The narrative had been established, and I was powerless to fight it. I became radioactive at Jefferson High. Students I'd never spoken to knew my name and my story. Teachers looked at me with uncomfortable pity. My friends from the AP track started avoiding me, not because they didn't care, but because association with me had become social suicide. Victoria Sterling, who'd been friendly in a casual way, stopped making eye contact when we passed in the hallways. Isaac Sterling stopped responding to my texts. Natalie Harlow told me she was sorry, but she couldn't study with me anymore, because her parents were worried about her reputation. Oliver Caldwell was the only one who still talked to me, but even he seemed uncomfortable, like he didn't quite know what to say. The isolation was crushing. Every day at school became an exercise in enduring stares and whispered comments. People pointing as I walked down the hallway. Groups going quiet when I approached. Teachers who'd once been encouraging now treating me with professional distance, like I was a problem student they needed to manage carefully, rather than a promising scholar they wanted to support. And then Mr. Harlow called me into his office in mid-February. I knew immediately that something was wrong from the expression on his face. He looked uncomfortable, almost guilty, as he gestured for me to sit down. He spent a long moment just looking at papers on his desk before he could bring himself to speak. "Jonathan, I need to talk to you about your college applications. There have been some complications." My stomach dropped. What kind of complications? "Several of the universities that had expressed strong interest in your application have contacted me with concerns. They've received information suggesting that you may have behavioral issues, that you demonstrated poor judgment and potentially unstable behavior. They want me to address these concerns before they can proceed with scholarship offers." I stared at him, not quite processing what he was saying. What information? From who? Mr. Harlow looked genuinely pained. I can't disclose the specific source, but Jonathan, I know about what happened at Prescott Memorial Hospital, and I know that some version of that incident has been shared with admissions offices at several of your top choice schools. I didn't do anything wrong, I said, my voice rising. I was trying to get help for my mother. I wasn't threatening anyone. I wasn't violent. I was just desperate. I believe you, Mr. Harlow said quickly. I do, but perception matters in this process. If universities have concerns about a student's judgment or stability, they become very cautious. They don't want to take risks with scholarship candidates who might become problems later. So what does this mean? He took a deep breath. It means that several schools that had been prepared to offer you full scholarships are now reconsidering. MIT has formally withdrawn their expression of interest. Stanford wants additional documentation, including letters specifically addressing the incident and your mental health status. Duke has requested a meeting with you, me and their regional admissions officer before they'll proceed. Northwestern has gone silent. The room seemed to spin. My careful plans, my years of perfect grades and tireless studying, my mother's sacrifices, all of it was collapsing because Dominic Prescott had decided to destroy my reputation as casually as someone swatting a fly. This was him, I said. Dominic Prescott. His father sits on boards at half these universities. One phone call from Theodore Prescott expressing concern about a troubled student would be enough. I don't know who contacted the schools, Mr. Harlow said, but his tone suggested he suspected the same thing. What matters now is damage control. We can still salvage this. There are other schools where the Prescotts don't have influence, state schools, smaller private universities. Your academic record is still strong. We just need to adjust expectations. Adjust expectations, I repeated numbly. You mean I'm not getting a full scholarship anymore? Not a full scholarship to a top-tier university, probably not. But partial scholarships are definitely still possible. We can find affordable options. This isn't the end of your education. But it felt like the end. The future that had seemed so certain just months ago, the future my mother had sacrificed everything to help me reach, had just evaporated. I'd be going to a lesser school with partial funding, taking on student debt, starting from a position of disadvantage instead of opportunity, and it had all been taken away by one wealthy kid who'd been offended that I dared to ask for help. I went through the motions for the rest of February and into March. I attended classes, I did homework, I met with Mr. Harlow to discuss alternative college options, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. My grades continued to slip. I got a C on a history test. I skipped an English assignment entirely. My class rank dropped from 2nd to 8th. It didn't matter, nothing mattered except my mother, and she was dying. She stopped being able to work in early March. Her supervisor called and told her to take medical leave, to focus on her health, to apply for disability. The loss of income was devastating. We couldn't pay rent. We couldn't pay utilities. We survived on donated food from a local church, on small loans from the few relatives we had. My mother spent most of her time sleeping, too weak and pain-ridden to do much else. I tried to take care of her. I skipped school regularly now, not even bothering to make up the work. What was the point? I cooked simple meals that she could barely eat. I helped her to the bathroom. I sat with her in the evenings, holding her hand, watching her drift in and out of consciousness. The cancer was winning. It was killing her slowly and painfully, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. She died on a Tuesday in mid-March. It was almost a relief when it finally happened. She'd been suffering so much, in so much pain, that some part of me was grateful when she stopped breathing. At least she wasn't hurting anymore. At least the terrible limbo was over. I was alone with her when she died. I'd stayed home from school, sitting beside her bed. reading aloud from one of her favorite books, even though I wasn't sure she could hear me anymore. Her breathing had been shallow and irregular all morning. Then suddenly it just stopped. One moment she was breathing, and the next moment she wasn't. The room became completely silent. I sat there for a long time, holding her hand, which was still warm but getting colder. I didn't cry. I was beyond tears at that point. I just sat there in the terrible silence and thought about how unfair everything was. How she'd worked so hard and sacrificed so much and died anyway. How the system had failed her. How wealthy people in beautiful hospitals had turned us away because we couldn't pay. How Dominic Prescott had laughed at her desperation. The funeral was on a Saturday. It was small, barely a dozen people. Some of my mother's co-workers from County General, a few neighbors. Mr. Harlow came, which I appreciated even though I could barely look at him without feeling angry about everything. There were no flowers except for a single cheap arrangement I'd bought with money I didn't have. No reception afterward. No gathering to remember her life. Just a brief graveside service conducted by a minister who'd never met her, reading generic, comforting words that meant nothing. I stood at her grave after everyone else had left, staring at the temporary marker that would eventually be replaced by a proper headstone once I figured out how to pay for one. The March wind was cold, cutting through my cheap suit jacket. I'd worn the same suit to college interviews, back when I'd had a future worth dressing up for. I made a promise that day. Not out loud. I didn't say the words, I just thought them, clearly and coldly, standing at my mother's grave. One day I will make Dominic Prescott feel exactly what I'm feeling right now. One day he will understand what it's like to be powerless, to have everything stripped away, to beg for something he desperately needs and be denied. One day I will destroy him so completely that he'll wish he'd shown me mercy when he had the chance. Asterisk, I didn't know how I would do it. I had no money, no power, no connections. I was an 18-year-old kid whose life had just fallen apart, whose future had been stolen, whose mother had died because wealthy people couldn't be bothered to help. But I made that promise anyway, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. The rest of senior year passed in a blur of not caring. I stopped going to classes entirely. I spent my days in our empty apartment, going through my mother's belongings, trying to figure out how to pay off her medical debt and funeral expenses. The school sent letters about truancy. Mr. Harlow called multiple times, leaving messages about graduation requirements and last-minute college options. I ignored all of it. I almost didn't graduate. I had to scramble in the final 2 weeks, completing makeup work and taking extra credit assignments just to meet minimum requirements. Victoria Sterling became valedictorian. I finished somewhere in the top 20, a far cry from the position I'd worked so hard to achieve. My college options had narrowed to state schools, where I'd received small, partial scholarships. Nothing like what I'd dreamed of, but at least it was something. I accepted admission to State University, a large public school 300 miles away. It wasn't prestigious. It wasn't anyone's first choice, but it was far enough from home that I wouldn't have to see Prescott Memorial Hospital every day. Far enough that I wouldn't have to risk running into Dominic Prescott. Far enough to start over where nobody knew my story. I left town 2 days after graduation. I packed my belongings into 2 suitcases and a backpack, sold most of my mother's furniture to pay off some debt, and got on a Greyhound bus. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I didn't attend graduation parties or senior events. I just left, and I never looked back. State University was massive. Over 30,000 students spread across a sprawling campus of generic academic buildings and crowded dormitories. I was assigned to a room in the cheapest dorm, the kind of place where the walls were cinder block and the furniture was ancient institutional surplus. My roommate was a kid named Zachary Whitmore, who was barely ever there, spent most of his time at his girlfriend's apartment, which was fine with me. I wanted to be alone anyway. I worked 2 part-time jobs from the start. During the day, I worked at the university library, shelving books and manning the circulation desk. At night, I washed dishes at a campus cafeteria. Between classes and work, I was occupied from 6 in the morning until midnight most days. I studied in whatever hours remained, usually between 1 and 4 in the morning, running on 4 or 5 hours of sleep and pushing myself until I was too exhausted to think clearly. The exhaustion was the point. When I was tired enough, I didn't think about my mother. I didn't think about that hospital lobby and Dominic Prescott's laugh. I didn't think about the promise I'd made at her graveside, the promise that seemed completely impossible to keep. I just worked and studied and moved from 1 hour to the next like a machine. But even in my exhaustion, I was building something. I'd declared a major in economics with a minor in business administration. Not because I loved economics, though I found the subject interesting enough, but because I wanted to understand how power actually worked in the world. I wanted to learn the rules of the game that people like the Prescotts played. I wanted to understand money and leverage and how to build the kind of position where nobody could ever humiliate me again. My professors noticed my intensity almost immediately. Economics wasn't a popular major at State. Most students were there to get a degree and move into middle management business jobs. They treated classes like boxes to check, learning enough to pass tests and then forgetting everything. But I approached every course like it contained secrets I needed to unlock. In my first semester microeconomics course, taught by a grad student named Elijah Davenport, who seemed barely older than his students, I completed every optional problem set. I read beyond the assigned chapters. I went to office hours with questions that went deeper than what was covered in lectures. Elijah started pointing out additional resources, suggesting books and articles that weren't on the syllabus. "You're different from my other students," he told me after class one day in November. "Most of them are here because they think economics sounds practical and will help them get jobs, but you're studying like you're trying to understand something specific, like you're building toward a particular goal." He was more perceptive than I'd expected. I gave him a vague answer about being interested in how systems worked, how resources were allocated. He nodded like he understood there was more to it, but wasn't going to push. "Well, whatever your goal is, you're on the right track. Your analytical skills are excellent. Have you thought about graduate school? A PhD program in economics?" I hadn't thought about graduate school because I couldn't afford it. I was already taking out loans for undergraduate work, already accruing debt that would take years to pay off. But the suggestion planted a seed. If I wanted real expertise, the kind of deep understanding that would give me leverage, I needed more than a bachelor's degree. My breakthrough came in a corporate finance course I took in the spring of my freshman year. The professor was Cameron Thornton, a man in his early 30s who'd worked in private equity before deciding he preferred teaching. He was intense and demanding in a way that most students found off-putting, but I loved his approach. He didn't teach from the textbook. He taught through case studies, real companies and real deals, making us analyze actual acquisitions and restructurings and explain what had worked and what had failed. I thrived in his class. For the first time since my mother's death, I felt intellectually engaged, challenged in a way that absorbed all my energy and attention. Dr. Thornton's assignments were complex, requiring hours of research and analysis, but I welcomed the difficulty. I turned in work that went far beyond what was required, analyzing deals from multiple angles, building financial models that showed different scenarios and outcomes. Dr. Thornton started using my work as examples in class, reading portions of my analyses aloud to demonstrate what deep thinking looked like. Other students started to resent me, this intense freshman who was making them look bad, but I didn't care. I wasn't there to make friends. I was there to learn everything I could about how corporations operated, how deals were structured, how power was built and destroyed through financial mechanisms. In the final week of the semester, Dr. Thornton asked me to stay after class. "Jonathan, I want to talk to you about your trajectory. Your work in this class has been exceptional. Graduate school level, honestly. What are you planning to do after graduation?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "Get a job, I guess. Start paying off student loans. Have you considered private equity or investment banking? With your analytical skills and work ethic, you'd be very competitive for those positions." I knew the basics about those industries. Private equity firms bought companies, restructured them, and sold them for profit. Investment banks facilitated large-scale corporate transactions. Both were paths to significant wealth if you were good enough and survived the brutal early years. "I've thought about it," I said carefully. "But those are competitive fields. I'm at State, not Harvard or Wharton. Firms don't recruit heavily here." "That's true," Dr. Thornton acknowledged. "But I have connections. I used to work at a small investment firm that specialized in distressed asset acquisition. They're always looking for talented analysts, and they're more interested in ability than pedigree. If you're interested, I could make an introduction." I felt my heart start beating faster. This was the kind of opportunity I'd been hoping for, without knowing exactly what it would look like. A way into the world where real financial power was built and wielded. "Yes," I said immediately. "I'm interested. Very interested." Dr. Thornton smiled. "I thought you might be. Let me make some calls. We'll talk more next semester." That summer, instead of going home, I didn't have a home to go back to. I stayed on campus and took additional courses: accounting, statistics, financial modeling. I worked full-time at the library during the day and spent my evenings studying, building skills that would make me valuable to the kind of firm Dr. Thornton had described. In September of my sophomore year, Dr. Thornton made good on his promise. He'd arranged an interview for me at Sterling Capital Partners, a small distressed asset investment firm located in the city about an hour from campus. The firm was run by a man named Alexander Whitfield, a former banker known for aggressive acquisition strategies and ruthless efficiency. I took a bus to the city on a Friday afternoon, wearing my one suit that I'd bought secondhand for college interviews. The firm's office was in a converted warehouse in an industrial part of the city, nothing glamorous or impressive. The elevator was ancient and slow. The hallways were bare concrete. Sterling Capital Partners occupied the third floor, a sprawling open office space with maybe a dozen people working at computers and talking on phones. Alexander Whitfield was a compact man in his 50s, with sharp eyes and no patience for small talk. He looked at my resume for maybe 30 seconds before tossing it aside. "Cameron says you're smart and hungry. That true?" "Yes, sir. You understand what we do here? We buy failing companies for pennies on the dollar, figure out if there's any value worth extracting, and either turn them around or strip them for parts. It's not glamorous. It's not about building things. It's about identifying value that others have missed and monetizing it as efficiently as possible." "I understand. Cameron also says you're at State on partial scholarship, which means you're probably in debt and probably motivated to make real money. That true too?" "Yes, sir." "Good. I don't want idealists working here. I want people who understand that business is about results, not feelings. If a company's dying, we're not doing anyone a favor by pretending it can be saved. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is execute an efficient liquidation and move on." He gave me a test project right there in his office, handed me a stack of financial documents from a failing manufacturing company, and told me to identify the company's key problems and recommend an action plan. I had 1 hour. I sat at an empty desk and dove into the documents. The company was drowning in debt from an ill-advised expansion, had outdated equipment that was expensive to maintain, and was losing contracts to more efficient competitors. But they owned valuable commercial real estate and had a few product lines that were still profitable. I put together a brief analysis recommending acquisition at a discount, immediate sale of the real estate to pay down debt, liquidation of unprofitable divisions, and either restructuring the remaining profitable units or selling them to a strategic buyer. Alexander reviewed my work with an expression that gave nothing away. Then he looked up. "You just recommended killing 300 jobs. Those jobs are going to disappear anyway," I said. "The company's on a path to bankruptcy. At least this way there's a chance to preserve the profitable divisions and save some positions." He smiled for the first time. "You're hired. Part-time during the school year, full-time during summers and breaks. Pay is modest to start, but if you're good, you'll learn more here than you would in any classroom." I started working at Sterling Capital Partners the following week. The job was exactly as unglamorous as Alexander had described. I spent my days building financial models, analyzing balance sheets, researching companies that might be acquisition targets, pulling together reports for Alexander and the small team of senior analysts. The work was technical and repetitive, but I was learning constantly. Alexander Whitfield turned out to be an excellent teacher, though a demanding one. He'd review my work with brutal honesty, pointing out flaws in my analysis, pushing me to think more deeply about how companies actually operated versus how they appeared on paper. He taught me to read between the lines of financial statements, to identify accounting tricks that masked problems, to understand the difference between temporary difficulties and fundamental failures. "Most people look at numbers and see math," he told me during one of our working sessions. "You need to look at numbers and see people. See the decisions executives made that led to those results. See where they overestimated their capabilities or underestimated their competition. See where they let ego or optimism cloud their judgment. Every failing company is failing for human reasons, not just financial ones." Over my sophomore and junior years at State, I became Alexander's protege. I worked 30 hours a week during school semesters, 60 or more during summers and breaks. I stopped working at the library and cafeteria. Sterling Capital Partners paid enough that I could focus entirely on school and the internship. My grades remained excellent. I maintained a 3.9 GPA, but my real education was happening at Alexander's firm. I worked on dozens of acquisitions during those years, small companies mostly, a regional retail chain that had been mismanaged into bankruptcy, a logistics company drowning in pension obligations, a family-owned manufacturing business that couldn't compete with Chinese imports. Every deal followed a similar pattern: identify the target, analyze the financials, determine what value could be extracted, make an offer, acquire control, restructure ruthlessly, and either sell or liquidate. It was cold work. Every acquisition meant job losses, pension cuts, communities affected by plant closures. I watched family businesses that had operated for generations get dismantled and sold off piece by piece. I sat in meetings where we calculated exactly how many employees we could fire without completely crippling operations. I learned to present these decisions as necessary business realities rather than human tragedies. Alexander taught me to separate emotion from analysis. "If you let yourself feel bad about necessary business decisions," he said, "you'll be paralyzed. These companies are already dying. We're not killing them. We're performing triage, saving what can be saved and efficiently disposing of what can't. That's not cruelty. That's reality." I absorbed that philosophy completely. I became very good at looking at struggling businesses and seeing only numbers, only opportunities, only leverage points that could be exploited. I stopped thinking about the people affected by our decisions. They were variables in equations, not individuals with families and lives. It was the only way to do the work without being consumed by guilt. By my senior year at State, I was one of Alexander's most valuable analysts. I could walk into a failing company and identify every weakness, every source of hidden value, every vulnerable point that could be pressured. I could structure deals that looked reasonable to desperate executives, but were actually carefully engineered to transfer maximum value to Sterling Capital Partners. I could sit across a negotiating table from people twice my age and remain completely calm while driving hard terms. Alexander started sending me to meetings alone, trusting me to represent the firm. I was 21 years old, wearing cheap suits from discount stores, and I was negotiating million-dollar acquisitions with executives who'd spent decades in their industries. Some of them underestimated me because of my age. That was a mistake. I had prepared more thoroughly than they had, understood their companies better than they did, and knew exactly how to exploit the desperation that had brought them to Sterling Capital Partners in the first place. I graduated summa cum laude with a 3.95 GPA, the single A- that prevented a perfect 4.0 was in an English literature course I'd taken to fulfill a general education requirement. It bothered me more than it should have, that single small imperfection in an otherwise flawless academic record. But Alexander laughed when I mentioned it. "Nobody cares about your GPA in the real world," he said. "The only thing that matters is results. Can you identify profitable deals? Can you structure acquisitions that maximize value? Can you execute ruthlessly when necessary? Those skills determine success, not grades." He offered me a full-time position at Sterling Capital Partners immediately after graduation. The starting salary was $75,000, which seemed like an enormous amount of money to someone who'd grown up poor and spent the past 4 years surviving on student loans and part-time work. More importantly, it was a chance to continue building the expertise I would eventually need. I accepted without hesitation. The next 4 years were a blur of deals and late nights and learning. I worked 80-hour weeks regularly, sometimes more. I became Alexander's right-hand person, the analyst he trusted for the most complex acquisitions, the person he sent to handle difficult negotiations. I was making good money now. My salary increased to $95,000 in my second year, $120,000 in my third. But I lived like I was still poor. Cheap apartment, no car, no expensive purchases. Every dollar I didn't absolutely need went into savings and investments. I was building capital. Not just money, though money was important. I was building knowledge and connections and reputation. Other investment professionals started to know my name. Banks I worked with on deal financing knew I was thorough and reliable. Lawyers who handled our acquisitions recognized my work quality. I was creating a network, slowly and deliberately, positioning myself for something bigger than being Alexander's employee. But I never forgot why I was doing this. Every acquisition I worked on, every company I helped dismantle, every dollar I made, it was all in service of a single goal that I never spoke about, but never stopped pursuing. I was learning how to destroy powerful institutions. I was building the skills and resources to eventually take on someone like the Prescotts. And I was patient. I could wait years if necessary. I could wait decades. The promise I'd made at my mother's graveside wasn't something I was going to rush. Revenge required perfect execution, and perfect execution required preparation. I kept track of the Prescotts, though not obsessively. I subscribed to healthcare industry newsletters and business publications that occasionally mentioned Prescott Memorial Hospital. I monitored their financial filings, which were public record since they'd taken on municipal bonds for one of their expansions. I followed Theodore Prescott's career, noted when he was featured in local business magazines or spoke at healthcare management conferences, and I followed Dominic's trajectory. He'd gone to an expensive private university, graduated with mediocre grades, and immediately been given a senior management position at his father's hospital. He bounced between different departments: operations, business development, facilities management, never staying anywhere long enough to accomplish anything meaningful, but also never being held accountable for his lack of results. He was exactly what I'd expected: a competent enough placeholder whose primary qualification was his last name, waiting to inherit control when Theodore eventually retired. I watched their expansion plans with particular interest. In the late 2000s, Prescott Memorial launched an aggressive growth campaign. They acquired a small community hospital in a neighboring county, then another. They built a new luxury wing catering to wealthy international patients. They opened a state-of-the-art cancer treatment center. Every expansion was financed with debt, massive loans from regional banks, municipal bonds, complex financing structures that leveraged their existing assets. I recognized the pattern immediately because I'd seen it dozens of times in companies that Sterling Capital Partners had acquired. Ambitious expansion driven more by ego than by sound financial planning. Theodore Prescott was building an empire, trying to establish Prescott Memorial as the dominant healthcare system in the region. He wanted a legacy, wanted to be remembered as the man who transformed a single successful hospital into a multi-facility powerhouse. But he was overextending. The new facilities weren't generating the revenue projections had promised. The luxury international patient business never materialized at the volume they'd anticipated. The cancer treatment center was losing money, too expensive to operate efficiently. Debt payments were eating up cash flow. They were trying to grow faster than their fundamentals could support, and the cracks were starting to show. I mentioned it to Alexander during a strategy meeting one day in 2032. I was 26 years old, had been working at Sterling Capital Partners for 4 years, and had just been promoted to senior analyst with significant decision-making authority. "There's a hospital system in my hometown that's overextended," I said casually. "Prescott Memorial. They've taken on massive debt for expansion, and their financials are getting shakier. Might be worth monitoring as a potential distressed asset in a few years." Alexander pulled up their public filings on his computer, spent a few minutes reviewing their balance sheet. "Healthcare acquisitions are complicated, lots of regulatory issues, but you're right, they're showing classic signs of over-leveraged growth. Put it on the watch list. If they start missing debt payments, we might have an opportunity." That was all I said. I didn't explain my personal connection. I didn't reveal that this wasn't just another potential deal, but the deal I'd been building toward for 8 years. I just noted it as an interesting opportunity and moved on. By my late 20s, I'd outgrown Sterling Capital Partners. Not intellectually, I was still learning from Alexander, but structurally. I was working for someone else, following someone else's strategy, making someone else wealthy. I'd saved almost $300,000 through careful living and smart investments. I had a reputation in the distressed asset investment community. I had connections with banks and lawyers and other investors. I was ready to build my own operation. I approached Alexander about it during one of our regular one-on-one meetings. I explained that I wanted to start my own fund, that I was grateful for everything I'd learned but needed to chart my own course. I expected him to be angry or disappointed, but he just smiled. "I've been waiting for you to say that. You've outgrown this place. You're too talented to keep working for someone else's percentage. Here's what I'll do. I'll be your first investor. Put in $200,000 of my own money, and I'll make introductions to some of my limited partners who might be interested in your fund. But you need a strong co-founder, someone who can handle the capital raising side while you focus on deal execution. You're brilliant at analysis and negotiation, but you're not a natural salesman." He was right. I could build financial models and structure acquisitions in my sleep, but I wasn't good at networking or fundraising or the relationship-building aspects of running an investment fund. I needed a partner who excelled at exactly the skills I lacked. Alexander introduced me to Harrison Davenport, a wealth management advisor who worked with ultra-high net worth clients. Harrison was in his early 30s, charismatic and polished in ways I could never be, comfortable in settings that made me feel like an imposter. But he was also sharp, understood financial strategy, and had access to exactly the kind of wealthy investors I'd need to capitalize a fund. We met for drinks at an expensive downtown restaurant I would never have chosen on my own. Harrison ordered wine that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a month. He asked about my background, my track record at Sterling Capital Partners, my vision for a new fund. I explained my strategy: identify mid-sized companies in financial distress, companies that were too small for major private equity firms to bother with, but large enough to have real value if properly restructured. Move fast, make aggressive offers, don't waste time on sentimental negotiations. It was the same approach I'd been executing for Alexander, but now I wanted to do it with my own capital and on my own terms. Alexander says you're the best analyst he's ever worked with, Harrison said. He also says you're intense and single-minded in a way that makes you occasionally difficult to work with, but ultimately very successful. That's exactly what I'm looking for. My clients want alternative investments with strong returns. They're tired of standard portfolio yields. They want exposure to higher risk, higher reward strategies, and they're willing to accept aggressive tactics if the results justify them. We formed a partnership. Harrison would handle capital raising and investor relations. I would handle deal sourcing, analysis, and execution. We'd split the management fees and carried interest according to a formula that reflected our respective contributions. Within 6 months, Harrison had raised $12 million from his network of wealthy clients. We formed Callahan Strategic Partners. I'd chosen the name Callahan from a list of names I'd memorized years ago, names that meant nothing to me personally, but sounded professional and forgettable, and began hunting for targets. Our first deal was a regional nursing home chain that had overextended during a period of favorable Medicare reimbursement rates. When the reimbursement rates changed, their margins collapsed, and they couldn't service their debt. We bought the chain for almost nothing, brought in professional management, renegotiated contracts, and sold it 18 months later for 3 times our purchase price. Our investors were ecstatic. Harrison's clients wanted to put more money in. We raised a second fund at $30 million. Over the next several years, I built Callahan Strategic Partners into one of the most successful distressed asset firms in the region. We completed deals that other investors thought were too risky or too complicated. We moved faster than larger firms, made decisions more aggressively, executed more ruthlessly. Our returns were excellent, consistently outperforming benchmark indices. Harrison's network expanded, bringing in more and more wealthy investors who wanted access to our strategies. The money started accumulating faster than I'd imagined possible. Not salary money, though I paid myself well enough. Real money, carried interest from successful deals, ownership stakes in restructured companies, management fees from growing funds. By my early 30s, I was worth several $1 million. By my mid-30s, it was tens of millions. I'd become exactly what I'd set out to become: someone with serious financial power, someone who could buy and dismantle institutions, someone who could sit across from desperate executives and hold their fates in my hands. I bought an expensive apartment in the city. I wore custom-tailored suits. I drove a luxury car. Not because these things brought me joy, they didn't, but because they were signals in the world I now inhabited. They communicated that I was successful, that I had resources, that I was someone to be taken seriously. The kid who'd been thrown out of a hospital for being poor had become someone who could write checks for millions of dollars without hesitation, but I never forgot where I came from. I never forgot my mother. and I never ever forgot the promise I'd made at her graveside. Throughout all of this, I'd continued monitoring Prescott Memorial Hospital's financial situation. Their expansion campaign had continued through the early 2000s, each new facility and program adding more debt to their balance sheet. Theodore Prescott was still chasing his vision of a healthcare empire, convinced that growth and market dominance would eventually lead to profitability. But the math wasn't working. Operating costs were increasing faster than revenue. Several of their acquired facilities were performing poorly, dragging down the entire system. The luxury international patient program had been a complete failure, generating almost no revenue while consuming significant resources. By 2038, they were showing serious financial stress. They missed a bond payment. They had to negotiate emergency extensions with their primary lenders. Local business press started running articles about their financial troubles, speculating about potential bankruptcy. Theodore Prescott gave interviews insisting everything was under control, that the temporary difficulties were just part of executing a long-term strategy, that Prescott Memorial was fundamentally sound. He was lying, or at least severely deluded. I could see their real situation clearly because I had access to their public filings, and because I'd analyzed hundreds of companies in similar positions. They were in a death spiral. Debt service was consuming their operating cash flow. They couldn't afford necessary capital improvements. They were cutting staff and reducing services, which hurt their reputation and drove away patients, which reduced revenue further, which made their debt situation even worse. They needed a massive capital infusion to survive, and they needed it soon. I started positioning myself carefully. Through various shell corporations and investment vehicles I controlled, I began acquiring pieces of Prescott Memorial's debt. When banks wanted to sell off distressed healthcare loans at a discount, I bought them. When bondholders got nervous about Prescott Memorial's situation and wanted to liquidate, I bought their positions. None of it was traceable to me personally or to Callahan's strategic partners. On paper, the debt was owned by half a dozen different entities with innocuous names, all apparently unconnected. In reality, I was gradually gaining control over Prescott Memorial's financial fate. By early 2041, the situation had become critical. Prescott Memorial needed immediate rescue financing, or they'd be forced into bankruptcy. Theodore Prescott was 72 years old, exhausted from years of fighting to save his empire, desperately reaching out to every major investment firm and private equity fund that might be able to help. Most weren't interested. Healthcare acquisitions were complicated and risky. The Prescott Memorial situation looked particularly messy, with multiple facilities, complex debt structures, and significant operational problems. But one potential investor kept appearing in the conversations Theodore's advisors were having. Mercer Holdings, a recently formed healthcare investment fund that specialized in distressed hospital acquisitions. Mercer Holdings had deep pockets, sophisticated understanding of hospital operations, and a track record of successful turnarounds. They'd saved several struggling hospital systems in neighboring states, providing capital and bringing in professional management teams that had restored profitability. Mercer Holdings was, of course, one of my shell corporations. The entire fund had been created specifically for this moment. I'd hired experienced healthcare executives to staff it, people with real expertise who could make the operation look legitimate. I'd capitalized it with money from my various funds and investments. I'd carefully built a track record by actually executing a few real hospital turnarounds, deals I'd identified specifically to establish credibility. The whole thing was an elaborate trap, and Theodore Prescott walked right into it. The negotiations were handled through multiple layers of intermediaries. I never met directly with the Prescotts during this phase. I let my representatives talk with their representatives, let them believe they were negotiating with a legitimate outside investor who was interested in preserving the hospital's reputation and operations. I made it difficult but not impossible. I demanded significant concessions, but not so many that they'd walk away in desperation. I wanted them to feel like they'd fought for reasonable terms, like they'd managed to secure a decent outcome under difficult circumstances. The final deal gave Mercer Holdings controlling interest in Prescott Memorial Hospital in exchange for immediate capital infusion and debt restructuring. The Prescotts retained minority ownership, and Theodore kept his position as CEO, though with significantly reduced authority and subject to oversight from Mercer Holdings representatives. It looked like a painful but survivable outcome. They'd given up control, but saved the hospital from bankruptcy and preserved their family's connection to the institution they'd built. They signed the agreements in March 2041. I remember the exact date because I'd been waiting for it for 23 years. 23 years since my mother died. 23 years since Dominic Prescott laughed at my desperation. 23 years since I made a promise at a graveside that I would destroy the people responsible. I let them believe they'd survived for several months. I wanted detailed information about every aspect of how the hospital operated before I made my final move. Mercer Holdings representatives monitored operations, attended management meetings, reviewed financial data, made suggestions about policy improvements. The Prescotts cooperated fully, believing this oversight was temporary, that once the hospital's financial situation stabilized, they might regain some autonomy. The information my people gathered was illuminating. Prescott Memorial Hospital had been systematically discriminating against low-income patients for years. Not explicitly, that would have been illegal, but through sophisticated financial screening processes and bureaucratic obstacles that effectively prevented poor people from accessing care. Patients without comprehensive insurance were subjected to extensive pre-approval requirements. They were required to provide financial guarantees before treatment could begin. They were steered toward less expensive treatment options that were often inadequate. In many cases, they were simply told the hospital couldn't accommodate them and they should seek care elsewhere. Internal documents made it clear this was deliberate policy. There were memos about optimizing patient mix to maximize revenue, financial analyses showing how treating more privately insured patients versus Medicaid patients improved profit margins, training materials for intake staff on how to appropriately screen potential patients without technically violating anti-discrimination laws. The whole system was designed to extract maximum value from wealthy patients while minimizing exposure to patients who couldn't pay premium rates. It was exactly what Dominic Prescott had explained to me 23 years ago. Prescott Memorial operated as a business, not a charity. They prioritized profitable patients and turned away people who couldn't afford to pay. My mother hadn't been denied treatment because her case was impossible or because the hospital lacked capacity. She'd been denied because she was poor, and poor patients weren't worth their time. I had everything I needed. I scheduled a board meeting for late September 2041. I informed Theodore and Dominic Prescott that attendance was mandatory, that Mercer Holdings would be presenting a comprehensive operational review and restructuring plan. They probably expected more difficult conversations about cost-cutting and efficiency improvements. They certainly weren't prepared for what actually happened. I attended the meeting in person. It was the first time I'd been in the same room as the Prescotts in over 20 years. The boardroom was on the top floor of Prescott Memorial Hospital, the building where I'd been humiliated and removed by security so long ago. The room was large and beautifully appointed, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the river and the city beyond. There was an enormous conference table, leather chairs, expensive artwork on the walls. Everything communicated power and success and permanence. Theodore Prescott was elderly now, in his early 70s, his hair completely white, his face lined with stress. He still dressed impeccably, still carried himself with authority, but the Years of fighting to save his hospital had clearly taken their toll. Dominic sat beside him, 40 years old, softer around the edges than he'd been in high school, but still recognizable. Still that same entitled expression, that same casual confidence of someone who'd never experienced real consequences. They didn't recognize me. Why would they? I was just another investor, another business professional in an expensive suit, another person with money who'd come to tell them how to run their hospital. I'd changed completely since I was 17. I was taller, filled out, polished in ways that teenage Jonathan Whitaker never could have been, and they'd probably forgotten I existed anyway. I was just one of countless desperate people they'd dismissed over the years. Several other board members were present. Mercer Holdings representatives, outside advisors, legal counsel, a full complement of people who would witness what came next. I let the meeting settle, let people go through preliminary business and financial updates. Then I stood up and took control of the room. Before we proceed with the operational review, I said, my voice completely calm and controlled, I want to make sure everyone in this room understands exactly who I am and why I'm here. Theodore Prescott looked at me with mild curiosity. Dominic barely seemed to be paying attention. My name is Jonathan Whitaker. Some of you know me as the principal investor behind Mercer Holdings. But 23 years ago, I was a 17-year-old high school student whose mother was dying of pancreatic cancer. We couldn't afford treatment, so I came to this hospital and asked for help. I saw Dominic's expression change. The boredom disappeared, replaced by something that might have been recognition, or maybe just confusion. Theodore leaned forward, suddenly paying close attention. Your son, I said, looking directly at Theodore, had me physically removed from this building. He told me that life wasn't fair, that some people were born with money and some people weren't, that your family had earned the right to decide who deserved help. He told me it was pathetic that I'd showed up begging for assistance. He made sure everyone at my school knew about my humiliation, and he used your family's influence to destroy my scholarship opportunities. The room had gone completely silent. Several board members were staring at me with expressions of shock. Theodore Prescott had gone pale. Dominic looked like he wanted to disappear. My mother, Eleanor Whitaker, died 3 weeks later without receiving any treatment. I was at her bedside when she stopped breathing. And at her funeral, I made a promise that one day I would make the people responsible understand exactly what they'd done. I opened the folder I'd brought and began distributing documents to everyone at the table. Financial analyses, patient screening policies, internal communications about revenue optimization, evidence of systematic discrimination against low-income patients, documented over years, approved at the highest levels of hospital administration. This hospital, I continued, has been operating exactly as your son explained it should operate 23 years ago, as a business, not a charity, maximizing profit by screening out patients who can't pay premium rates. There are hundreds of cases like my mother's, people who were denied care not because this hospital couldn't help them, but because helping them wasn't profitable enough. Theodore tried to speak. I held up a hand, cutting him off. I now control a majority stake in Prescott Memorial Hospital. I control enough debt to force bankruptcy if I choose. I control the board votes necessary to make any decision I want. Your family's survival depends entirely on my decision. So I want everyone here to understand the power dynamic clearly. I hold all the leverage, and you have none. The panic was visible now. Dominic was looking at his father, clearly hoping Theodore would have some solution, some way to fight back. But Theodore understood. He'd spent decades in business. He recognized a complete defeat when he saw one. I could destroy this hospital, I said. Force bankruptcy, liquidate the assets, sell everything off piece by piece. Your family would lose everything. The Prescott name would become synonymous with institutional failure and discrimination. That would be satisfying in a certain way, but it would also be wasteful. I paused, letting them think maybe I was offering a way out. So instead, I'm going to restructure this organization completely. Effective immediately, the Prescott family loses all ownership stakes. Theodore, you're removed as CEO. Dominic, you're stripped of all executive authority. The hospital will be reorganized as a nonprofit medical center with a mission focus on providing accessible health care, regardless of ability to pay. All patient screening policies will be eliminated. The focus on revenue optimization through patient selection will end. This facility will operate the way a hospital should operate, to provide care to people who need it. Theodore found his voice. You can't do this. We have legal protections. We have contracts. Your lawyers are welcome to review the documentation, I said calmly. Every step I've taken is completely legal. The debt restructuring agreements you signed gave Mercer Holdings exactly the authority I'm exercising now. You agreed to these terms when you thought you were dealing with a legitimate rescue investor. You didn't realize you were handing control to the person you'd wronged decades ago. I turned to Dominic, looking at him directly for the first time. You told me that life wasn't fair, that some people were born with money and connections and other people weren't. You were absolutely right, but here's what you didn't understand. Circumstances change. The powerless kid you humiliated spent 23 years learning exactly how to take apart institutions like this hospital, learning how money and leverage and debt and corporate control actually work, building the specific skills and resources I'd need to be sitting across from you today in a position of absolute power. Dominic looked sick. He couldn't speak. He just stared at me with an expression of complete horror. The hospital will be renamed, I continued, looking around the table at all the board members. It's going to be called the Eleanor Whitaker Memorial Medical Center. My mother's name will be on this building. It will be on the signage, on the stationery, on every piece of marketing material. Every patient who comes here will see her name and know that this facility exists to provide care without discrimination, to honor the memory of a woman who was denied treatment because she couldn't afford it. I turned back to the Prescotts. Theodore, you have until end of business today to clear out your office. Dominic, you're being retained as a junior administrative assistant. Your salary will be adjusted to match your actual value to this organization, which is minimal. You'll be reporting to the new executive director, who will be appointed next week. If you choose to stay, you'll be an employee with no special status, no family name to protect you, no authority whatsoever. You'll exist in this system, following orders, doing menial work, completely powerless. This is cruel, Theodore said, his voice shaking. This is vindictive. I looked at him with the same cold expression his son had looked at me with 23 years earlier. Your son told me that life isn't fair, that some people build success and earn the right to make their own choices. I've built my success. I've earned my position, and I'm exercising my right to restructure this hospital according to my vision. The difference between your family and me is that I'm using my power to help people instead of turning them away. I started gathering my documents. The legal paperwork will be filed this afternoon. The announcement will go out to staff and media tomorrow. The transition begins immediately. This meeting is adjourned. I walked out of that boardroom without looking back. I didn't need to see their reactions, didn't need to witness their defeat. It was already complete, total, irreversible. Everything they'd built, everything they'd valued, everything they'd taken for granted had just been stripped away, and there was nothing they could do about it. The restructuring of Prescott Memorial Hospital into the Eleanor Whitaker Memorial Medical Center took 6 months to fully implement. The legal challenges that Theodore Prescott's lawyers filed were quickly dismissed. The debt agreements were ironclad. The board votes were secured. There was no viable path to fighting back. Theodore tried to salvage something through public relations, giving interviews about how he was being unfairly targeted, how his hospital had always tried to serve the community, how this hostile takeover was driven by personal vendetta rather than legitimate business concerns. But the evidence of systematic patient discrimination was overwhelming. Local media ran stories about families who'd been turned away from Prescott Memorial, about people who'd been denied care because they couldn't afford it. The Prescott family's reputation collapsed under the weight of documentation showing they'd built their empire by cherry-picking profitable patients. Dominic Prescott stayed on as a junior administrative assistant. I received monthly reports about his performance. He was apparently adequate at his assigned tasks, which involved scheduling and basic paperwork, nothing requiring significant judgment or authority. He showed up on time, he completed his work, he kept his head down. Every day he walked into that building beneath the sign bearing my mother's name. Every day he worked in an office in the administrative wing, HCDE, small space that was nothing like the executive suite he'd once expected to inherit. Every day he experienced what it was like to be powerless, to be just another employee with no special status, to understand that his family name no longer protected him from consequences. Theodore Prescott tried to rebuild. He wrote a book about healthcare management, using his experience to try to position himself as an expert on hospital operations. It sold poorly. He took consulting work, advising other healthcare systems on expansion strategies. But everyone in the industry knew what had happened to Prescott Memorial, and most potential clients were wary of someone who'd presided over such a spectacular failure. He gave occasional talks at industry conferences, presented panels on navigating financial difficulties, but he was diminished. A cautionary tale, an example of how quickly things could fall apart when you built on the wrong foundation. The Eleanor Whitaker Memorial Medical Center thrived under new management. The shift to nonprofit status and accessible care mission attracted excellent physicians and staff who were motivated by the opportunity to provide real health care rather than chasing revenue optimization. Patient satisfaction improved dramatically. Community reputation went from problematic to exemplary. Within 2 years, the facility was being held up as a model for how healthcare should be delivered, proof that quality care and social mission could coexist with financial sustainability. I should have felt complete satisfaction. I'd accomplished exactly what I set out to do. I'd honored my mother's memory in the most permanent, visible way imaginable. I'd destroyed the people who'd wronged us, stripped away everything they valued, forced them to experience powerlessness and humiliation. I'd won so completely that there was no ambiguity, no possibility of them recovering. The Prescott Empire was gone, replaced by something better, and I'd made it happen, through pure strategic thinking and patient execution. But satisfaction never came. The victory felt hollow. I'd spent 23 years building toward this moment. 23 years studying and working and accumulating power and positioning myself to execute perfect revenge. And now that it was done, I didn't know what I was supposed to do next. The goal that had driven every decision I'd made since I was 17 years old was achieved. The promise I'd made at my mother's graveside was kept, but I felt empty instead of triumphant. I thought about my mother constantly. What would she say if she could see what I'd become? Would she be proud that I'd created a hospital in her name that helped people the way she should have been helped? Or would she be horrified that I'd spent over 2 decades consumed by anger, that I'd built my entire life around the goal of revenge, that I'd let one terrible experience fundamentally define who I became? My mother believed in kindness and integrity. She believed in working hard and treating people with dignity. She believed that good things happen to good people, that the universe eventually rewarded merit. She was wrong about all of that. I'd learned that the hard way, but she genuinely believed it, and I don't think she would have wanted me to become someone whose greatest accomplishment was systematically destroying other people's lives. I'd achieved total success by any external measure. Callahan's strategic partners continued to be wildly successful, managing over $500 million across multiple funds. I was worth well over $100 million personally. I had power and influence in the investment community. I just executed one of the most complete hostile acquisitions in recent healthcare history. I'd won absolutely. But I had no one to share it with. No close relationships, no family. My friends, if I could call them that, were business associates and professional contacts. Harrison Davenport was a capable business partner, but not someone I'd ever confided in about anything personal. Alexander Whitfield had retired 2 years earlier, and we'd lost touch. I had employees and professional connections, but no one who actually knew me, no one I trusted, no one I was close to. I'd sacrificed everything to become someone capable of revenge. I'd built myself into a weapon, honed and sharpened and perfectly designed for a single purpose. And now that I'd been used, now that the target was destroyed, I didn't know how to be anything else. I go to the office every day. I review investment opportunities. I structure deals. I make decisions about acquisitions and restructurings. Callahan's strategic partners continues to grow and succeed. But the work feels mechanical now. I'm executing strategies I've executed hundreds of times before. There's no challenge anymore, no drive. I was motivated by a specific goal, and now that goal has been achieved, I'm just going through motions. Sometimes I drive by the Eleanor Whitaker Memorial Medical Center, never going inside, just parking across the street and looking at the building, at the sign bearing my mother's name, at the patients walking through those doors to receive care without discrimination. It's a good thing I created. A genuinely positive contribution. But I can't feel proud of it, because I know the motivation wasn't really about helping people. It was about revenge, about making the Prescotts suffer. The good outcomes were just a side effect of my desire to cause pain. I think about Dominic Prescott sometimes, still working in that building as a powerless administrative assistant, walking beneath my mother's name every single day, knowing exactly who destroyed his family's empire and why, living with the permanent knowledge that the person he humiliated turned out to be capable of total revenge. He understands now what I tried to explain 23 years ago, that circumstances change, that the powerless can become powerful, that cruelty has consequences. And I think about myself, 41 years old, wealthy beyond anything I could have imagined as a teenager, successful in every conventional sense, the architect of perfect revenge, the person who kept an impossible promise. But I also think about the cost. 23 years focused on a single goal. 23 years building myself into someone capable of destroying powerful institutions. 23 years sacrificing relationships and experiences and joy in service of cold, patient anger. 23 years becoming exactly the kind of person I once despised. Someone who sees other human beings as tools and obstacles, who reduces everything to power dynamics and leverage, who values winning above everything else. The person who walked into Prescott Memorial Hospital 23 years ago was desperate and powerless, but he was also fundamentally good. He believed in fairness and justice. He believed that people deserved to be treated with dignity. He believed his mother's life mattered, that her death was wrong, that the world should care about people like her. The person I am now is powerful and successful, but I'm not sure I'm good. I'm not sure I'm anything except cold and calculating and permanently angry. I achieved total revenge, but I destroyed something essential in myself along the way. I became so focused on winning that I forgot to ask whether winning was worth what I had to give up to make it happen. I stand in my expensive apartment, looking out at the city lights, and I realize that maybe the Prescotts weren't the only ones I destroyed. Maybe I destroyed myself too, just more slowly and more completely. They lost their hospital and their reputation and their legacy. I lost something harder to define: the capacity to be someone other than this, the ability to forgive or move forward or find meaning in something beyond revenge. Every day, Dominic Prescott walks beneath my mother's name. Every day he's reminded that he lost everything. Every day he lives with the consequences of his cruelty. And every day, I live with the knowledge that I've become exactly what I set out to destroy: someone who sees power as the only thing that matters, who values control above humanity, who chose revenge over healing. I won completely, irreversibly, perfectly. But I'm starting to understand that maybe winning isn't the same thing as succeeding, that destroying your enemies isn't the same as honoring the people you love, that becoming powerful enough to hurt the people who hurt you doesn't actually make the hurt go away. My mother believed in goodness and kindness and the essential decency of human beings. She was wrong about how the world works, but she was right about what matters. And I spent 23 years becoming someone she wouldn't recognize, someone she wouldn't be proud of, someone who chose revenge over the values she tried to teach me. I got my revenge. I destroyed my enemies. I honored my mother's memory in the most permanent way possible. But I don't think I'll ever forgive myself for what I had to become to make it happen. Stories like this happen more often than we think. Subscribe if you want to hear the ones that usually stay unspoken. And if this story made you pause, a like helps the channel grow.